for those that don't know who I am, I'm Stacy Pavlizzi. I'm the director of the Center for Entrepreneurship. For those who don't know what the Center for Entrepreneurship is, we are a center within Owen that is completely dedicated to helping and supporting student founders, those that want to join startups, and then those that want to be involved and pursue a career in venture capital. So we really like to think of ourselves as a connection point for our student entrepreneurs in the ecosystem. Also, we work with alums, community members as well, who are looking to access the skills, the resources, or the funding to pursue their entrepreneurial careers, if you will. So a little bit about today. We are really thrilled that we have Brian with us today and Dean Johnson, who's going to be moderating, which is not normally the case, so we're incredibly lucky. And Brian is definitely a really successful entrepreneur and now on the funding side, if I'm correct. So he's going to share a little bit about his journey, and if you have questions, we'll be pausing for questions too, because we definitely want this to be interactive as well. I think that's everything. So Dean Johnson, I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome.
Thank you,
Stacy.
Yeah.
Well, we're excited to have Brian here today because in so many ways, Brian is just a great Owen story, and of course, as you'll find out from today, it's not a picnic walk story. There's a lot of hard work and sweat equity along the way, but it's really fun to see kind of a full arc of a startup from Brian's time earlier in auditing in Ernst & Young and carrying that through to a company he started here really right out of school.
Yeah.
And a lot of kind of interesting Owen connections along the way, including some early funding from the National Capital Network, which is a venture fund here in town that was also founded by a group of Owen folks and is still cranking along today, making investments. And now Brian sits on the board of the National Capital Network, is an angel investor through that, but also through his own funds. So it truly is kind of a full circle kind of story. But I'm going to let him tell some of the details of that because it's way more fun to hear from Brian. And so, Brian, tell me, did you know when you got to Owen you wanted to do entrepreneurship? Was that, like when you walked in the door, was that something on your mind?
It was. I'd always wanted to be an entrepreneur. That was kind of the game plan. My grandmother had been an entrepreneur. She started a dress shop in the middle of Green Hills, which is the Green Hills Mall now, where she was. My grandfather didn't graduate college, didn't go to college, but he had a construction business. My mom was a real estate agent. So it was just kind of entrepreneurial in my blood. So I grew up doing the typical lemonade stands, and I started a driveway sealing company when I was a senior in high school, and then in first year of college. And so I always knew I wanted to do something entrepreneurial. So when I came back here, the game plan at that time, I had gone, as Dean Johnson said, I had started with Ernst & Young in audit. And actually, I had gone to, one of the things I recommend, go to network. I talked to a bunch of entrepreneurs, and I talked to them and said, hey, what are one of the things that you would do differently? Was one of the questions I was asked, and almost without exception, they all said I'd take more accounting classes. And so I took a lot of accounting classes. I didn't really like accounting. And I kind of found that I was closer to an accounting degree than a finance degree. So I said, well, that'll set me apart, make me different, maybe help me get into Vanderbilt, because that was the only graduate school I was going to apply to. And so I went out and did audit as a background, because I felt like that was, accounting's kind of the foreign language of business, right? Regardless of where you go, numbers are the foreign language. And so I always thought that, that would be helpful to me, and then I was going to come back to Owen and ideally go work for an early stage startup business. So this was in '99. And at the time, the dot-coms were going crazy. So my game plan was I'd worked at EY, gone over to PricewaterhouseCoopers and the M&A group, and then come back to Owen, and I was thinking about going and interning and working for a dot-com at that point in time. So that was the initial game plan. But when I came back here, Jermaine Bear, who many of you know his name, hopefully, was really a mentor of mine. But he, in my first year class, right, I had to write a business plan for his entrepreneurship class. And so I took an idea that I had during my time at EY and then at PwC that was a manual-based paper process that was very inefficient. And at the same time, I felt ineffective because I had figured out how I would commit fraud against Ernst & Young and Pricewaterhouse. And I'm like, here I am, 24, 25. I could commit fraud against two of the largest accounting firms in the world. Somebody else who's been intent to commit fraud probably has figured this out. And so as I started doing my research, sure enough, they had. So the fraud is anytime you guys hear of a company that inflates its revenue, that is a confirmation fraud, because if you have revenue, the offsetting journal entry, not to get to in the debits and credits, but is either cash, you've received it, or it's a receivable, so you're owed it. And so in either case, as an auditor, we can't come in and say, show me your revenue, but we can say, show me your cash, or let me verify that your receivables are valid. And so that process is called the confirmation process. And so if you want to inflate revenue, you have to have somehow manipulated the confirmation process in order to get either fake bank account balances or fake receivables. And so as I did my research, that's exactly what was happening. So I said we could use this crazy new thing called the internet that was only about 3 or 4 years old and create a secure clearinghouse. And so that was the business idea. And I wrote it up, and Jermaine said, hey, you ought to do that. And I'm like, I don't have any money. So there's no way I can. And I think Jermaine pretty much told everybody that wrote a business plan they ought to go start their business. At the time, I kind of felt like he was telling me I had something special. I don't know whether he believed it or not, but I did. And I was actually interviewing for an internship, and then at the end of my first year of business school here, my father was killed in an accident. And so I ended up, my mom and brother and I took my dad's life insurance policy, and that was the seed capital for confirmation.com. So I started that in between the first and second year of business school here. So I incorporated in June of 2000 between my first and second year of Owens. So that's how it got kicked off. So with Jermaine probably giving me a little encouragement to go do so.
Yeah, and for those of you who don't know who Jermaine was, he was a very early faculty member here at Owen, joined in the middle 70s.
Original faculty member, I think.
I don't know if he was, I don't think he was part of the 69
original
crowd, but he was definitely one of the early players and taught accounting for years and years, but really became the father of entrepreneurship for Nashville in a lot of ways. I mean, he really got it rolling here at Owen, but not just here at Owen. I mean, the Entrepreneurship Center downtown has roots that run back to Jermaine, as does the Nashville Capital Network and lots of other things here in town. So he was really a luminary in that space. Yeah. But I think what students remember best about him was his door was always open, right? It was always open, and he had a little poster up on the side of his door. It was this kind of proverbial picture of like a stork. It's like eating a frog, and the frog's like got its hands out holding the stork's neck closed, and basically the point being, if the frog let go, the stork's gonna eat it, right?
Yeah.
So and the tagline is never give up, right? Yep. And that's what
it's at the bottom of every one of his emails.
Yeah, and he told every single student, don't give up. Don't give up. How'd you get the first customer?
So really, your first customer typically is going to be somebody that you ask for a favor. So that's what I ended up doing. So my business was a network model, which is not, it's probably the most difficult to build, but once you build it, that network really becomes the biggest moat to competitors. And so I needed to have both banks and accounting firms on my network, right? So it's kind of like eBay. You need buyers and sellers on the network in order for it to have any value to either side. But once you build it, everybody kind of comes there because the network's already there, and there's where the value is, and it's very hard for somebody to come in and take your customers. But everybody I'd go to, they'd say, well, we like your idea, but you don't have anybody on the other side, right? And so I was trying to, one of my board members always said I was trying to make a ham sandwich. I didn't have any ham or bread.
Just a little mustard.
Yeah, I just had an idea. And so really I went to our accounting firm and said, hey, I need you to sign up to be one of our customers, and they did. And then at the time, my grandfather had worked at First American Bank and retired, and there was a new startup bank called Pinnacle Bank, and Rob McCabe had worked with him, and my grandmother and grandfather called Rob and said, hey, will you meet with our grandson? And so I had graduated from Owen at this point in time and used all my friends at school to help build the marketing plan and the IT plan and those kind of things. But I was trying to kick it off, and I go to meet with Rob, and we sit down. It was actually Lattimore Blackmore & Kane, top 50 accounting firm. We were in their lobby. They were opening up their new office. And he said, hey, meet me there an hour before the kickoff. I said, great. So we meet. And my grandmother, who's very practical, she always had a bumper sticker that said, happiness is a positive cash flow. And I'm her grandson, and here I was married, had one child, one on the way. We'd adopted one, so we kind of had two at the time, a 14-year-old. And we had no revenue. And so I sit down with Rob, and I'll never forget, he says, so, your grandmother says you need a job. And I said, no, sir, I don't need a job. I need for your bank to use our service. And I was like, all my grandmother did is tell him that, I had no money and I graduated, I was a CPA with an MBA and I needed a job.
Thanks, Grammy.
Yeah. Yeah. She's like, I'm sure my grandson has this idea, but what he really needs is a job. And so that's how it kicked off. So it was really just asking a favor. And Rob said, I told him the idea, and he said, sure, just come down to the bank, and went down to the department that does confirmations, and we got him signed up. So that was really our first bank and first accounting firm. And then once you have those, right, then their competitors pay attention, right? So once we had Pinnacle, Bank of Nashville wanted to sign up, the Bank of Green Hills, that turned into Union Planners, which was based out of Memphis. When Union Planners turned into First Tennessee because they were also there. Trustmark came on because they were heavy in Tennessee, Mississippi, and so that began to build our network. So we really started in Middle Tennessee, then Tennessee, Mississippi, and Alabama, then the U.S. And when I ended up selling the business, we had users in 184 countries. So and funny enough, I always tell people this. You guys can ask any questions, by the way. Let's make this interactive because I'm here for you guys. I was literally in your seats not long ago. But when I wrote my business plan for Jermaine, I'll tell you two things. One, I never thought I'd be international. And yet when we sold, after having the business for 19 years, we were in 184 countries. And I'll also tell you that I still haven't hit my 5th-year business plan numbers yet. So, every entrepreneur is a little optimistic and aggressive. I thought for sure I'd hit like those year 3 numbers, I'd sell and go do it again. But you got to take that with a grain of salt. So I was pretty optimistic in my original projections of what we could do. But it was interesting that I never even assumed that we'd get international with the business, and yet we ended up over half our revenue was coming internationally. So
Yeah. So what did the first 5 years look like? Was it you and
so
partner,
it was
you and 3 other people? What was?
Yeah, it was. So I ended up there was 3 other people I had brought into the business, and right when I graduated, when the internet bubble had burst, so this was in May of 2001. So the internet bubble had burst, and here I was with the CEO. I was 26, the CEO of a .com business, and it's like, okay, it's okay, we can figure this out. The .com thing, the valuations aren't where they were. It's not crazy anymore, but I can make this happen. And so I had hired one person, Jeanette Hauser. She was my first employee. And then brought on a partner and another guy to do sales. So it was really the 4 of us. And we were out there trying to sell, and we were going to go out and raise money from family and friends and aunts, uncles, cousins. I always tell people Thanksgiving was a shareholders meeting for me. And so we'd gone out and we were pitching. We had a group in town that was going to lead a $1 million round of funding. So they were going to do $200,000. We had $800,000 of follow-on financing, assuming the lead investor came in. And you always need that lead investor. They're critical. Somebody set the terms and do the due diligence, say, hey, I'm in, right? Raise their hand. And Chris, my business partner, and I, really my mentor in business, we went and we pitched. And there was a couple other companies that were pitching that night, and the guy who was kind of sponsoring us at the investment committee meeting came into our little conference and said, hey, everything looked great. Just hang out here for a little bit. We got to hear these other ones, and then we'll come in. And so we hung out for about an hour or two. Then he came back in and said, hey, we've got we've got an issue with one of our portfolio companies. You guys go home. We'll call you tomorrow. No problem. The next day, he calls us about 10 o'clock, and he says, hey, so sorry. We were up till 1:30 in the morning. We've got to fire the CEO of a portfolio company. We're going to have to change. It was chaotic and crazy. We didn't get a chance to vote, but we're going to vote at next week's meeting. And I've got my entrepreneurial risky side, but I've also got my CPA, conservative side. So I always had the PowerPoints and the slides and the extra, thumb drive and those kind of things. So I still have the old slicks, the ones that you used to put on the thing, the overheads. The day that we pitched was September 7th. September 8th is when they called us, and 3 days later, 9/11 happened. And the entire world stopped, right? The entire financial market came to a crashing halt. And businesses that had revenue but weren't cash flow positive, their VCs, their funding sources dried up. We didn't have revenue at that point. We were pre-revenue. And so at that point, it was crazy. So the internet bubble had just burst. 9/11 happened, and here I was. I'd already spent the $200,000 in my dad's life insurance policy. My aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, college roommates, their parents, high school friends, all had given me anything from $500 to $5,000 each. And I was on the hook for that money. And, I was like, we got to figure this out. And it was really, really hard. Averbush actually used to slope, and when you came in, you had the stadium seating. And I remember the week of graduation from Owen, you get a present, you show up, and at the time, they would hand you an envelope with how much your bill was for the whole 2 years. And my bill was $92,000 when I opened that, because I'd done the whole thing on student loans, right? And I was like, wow, that's a lot. And here I was, I had a bill for $92,000 for my student loans. I had no income. I was married. We had 2 children, a 14-year-old, and it was crazy, right? And the internet bubble burst and 9/11 happened. And so I moved the business into my grandmother's garage.
I told you this would get interesting.
Yeah. I moved the business into my grandmother's garage, and I paid everybody in equity. Actually, funny story, Dave Malone, one of the guy who was our sales guy, it was funny, I was trying to convince him to come join us and help us with sales. And I said, hey, one of the things you can do is you can actually invest in the business. And so he invested in the business, and then I paid him his own money back for a little while until we couldn't. But basically, for 2 years, we lived on no more than 30 or 60 days worth of capital. So every 30 days, we had no idea where the money was coming from. And that was really hard, especially when you got crying kids at home, a wife who's like, hey, go back to Ernst & Young and get a real job and a paycheck. I'm sure my in-laws were like, who is this loser that you married? He's got all these degrees and a CPA and an MBA, but he has no income. I mean, the first year out of Owen, I made $10,000. And that wasn't a lot. And it was tough. So for those 2 years, I always tell people, you have to lead from the front. Leadership is not standing behind the troops and telling them where to go. That's managing. Leading means standing up front and taking the bullets and the arrows first. And so I never did anything that I didn't ask everybody else to do. And so if I was going to ask them to take half salary, I was taking no salary. I remember turning to the team, and over the years, my grandparents had always given all their grandchildren $100 worth of First American stock at their birthday and Christmas. And I had about $20,000 of First American stock, and at that time was in AmSouth. And I remember turning to everybody and saying, look, this is the last $20,000 I got. It's going to last us about 60 days because we were on about a $10,000 a month burn. I said, if I'm going to put this in, I need you to promise me that you're not sharpening up your resume and out there looking for a job. And they said, we're in, and I cashed that out and put 20,000 in. And we had so many, we were really just guided over the time, because I remember there was one time where our insurance, but we always paid health insurance the whole time for everybody, $2,500 a month. And the insurance bill was coming due on that Monday. I had to send the check in. And on Friday, we didn't have any money in the bank. And so I went, and at the time, CarMax had just started their commercials where they said, we'll buy your car, you don't have to buy one of ours. And so I had my Honda Accord that I had in graduate school and took it over. They were giving me like $10,500. And I told my wife, look, I'm gonna have to sell the car. And as I said, that's 30 days worth of capital, max. And she was like, what are you doing? Like, this is crazy. And I said, yeah, but it's 30 days worth of capital. And so I said, I'm gonna have to sell it Monday. And fortunately, we opened the mail, and an investor that we'd been courting had sent us a check. And we opened up the mail, had no idea he was sending it. And it just said, hey, I decided to invest, here's a check. And so many things like that happened over the years. We had one investor, great guy named Chuck Ritson. He actually went to Owen as well. And he'd invested because his accountant was our accountant. And our accountant was like, hey, this is a pretty good idea. And these guys are working hard. Well, again, we were at the end of our rope. And Chris and I go over to Chuck's home office, and we sit down, and we must have just looked like we'd been beaten. And we sit down, and without even saying anything, he goes, how much do you need? And we said, well, here's our expenses. We basically operate on $10,000 a month. And he said, well, I'll commit to 5 months, $50,000. Come down, my assistant will give you a check each month for $10,000, and that'll give you 5 months. And we stretched that to 6. And then we were able to actually raise a round of funding eventually. So after about 2 years of scraping by on 30 to 60 days worth of capital, we were able to actually raise a $750,000 debt round. So it was debt that was convertible to equity. And that kind of gave us, for the first time, a year's worth of capital to be able to grow and, not sweat it. So it was a tough time. It was extremely hard. I always tell people, if it was my own money, I would have quit and gone back to work for Ernst & Young or somebody like that, because it was too hard. But because I had taken other people's money, and at the time it ended up being $642,000, I know exactly how much I owed them, I had to pay that back. And so it wasn't one of those situations where I could leave the keys on the counter when it got really, really hard. I had to say, look, this thing's either going to fail 100%, and they're just going to shut off our electricity and the cable bill, or we're going to succeed 100%. There was no quit, because to me, I felt like I owed all those people money, because your earliest investors are going to invest in you and in who you are. They're not investing in the idea, they're investing in who you are and your passion and belief that you could be successful. As I said, my grandmother, Patty, she would always call me during first quarter, and she'd be like, hey, it's tax season, you're really busy. And I'd be like, yeah, I'm really busy, but we don't do taxes. Like, I have nothing to do with it. I don't even know how to do taxes. We're an audit service. It just happens to be busy season too. So she invested, and my grandfather invested. Again, they didn't even know what the business did. They just thought we were in the tax business. We had nothing to do with taxes. So interesting times, very tough early on.
So when did you know it was working? It was really good, When did you turn cash positive, I guess?
For our business, because we had a low dollar amount in terms of the price, so it was basically $20 a transaction. We had to get a lot of transactions. And so it took us a long time to get to cash flow positive, but we were growing kind of that up and to the right the whole time. And our investors always believed in us. And so that $750,000 group that was all angel investors in Nashville, and we tried to pitch everywhere else. I mean, I was in Dallas, I was in Atlanta, I was in Kentucky. I mean, we went all over, and then everybody was like, well, why aren't the people who know you best investing in you, right? It's like, okay, I get it. So we had to get local. And that's where your money's gonna come from. So we took that, and we started to grow. And then those groups always were basically about a third of the investment group. They always reinvested, and then they brought their kind of family and friends. So like one investor would, one time I remember the next round he brought his 2 son-in-laws. And then the next time it was his 2 son-in-laws, his wife's uncle, and a friend, right? So that one investor ended up becoming 5. And that's our investor base group. But we did a $750,000 debt round then we ended up doing $400,000 in a bridge. Then we did a $3 million preferred A offering, and then a 5 1/4. We did 5, and we were oversubscribed at that point because we were doing well. And so that was the funding. So all told, ended up raising about $11 million for the business. But what's really cool, when we were raising the first $3 million, as Dean Johnson said, the Nashville Capital Network at the time didn't have a fund. And Sid Chambliss, who went here, he was in the class behind me. He was walking out because he was officing here, and I was walking in to speak at one of Jermaine's classes, and he said, hey, how's the funding going? I mean, we're literally at the front door. And I said, oh, we're at 2-4, we're trying to get to 3. He's like, call me, I think we can round that out. And I called Sid later that day. He put us in front of his angels that were in the NCN, and we rounded out the other $600K. And so, I mean, it all happened just right here. And so that was really cool. So we did that $3 million, and then the 5 really for growth capital. And we hit cash flow positive in 2009. That year, I guess the year before, Bank of America had mandated our service. They said they'd been sued for $10 billion because Ernst & Young had missed the Parmalat fraud. Parmalat faked a $4.9 billion bank account balance, the largest fraud Europe's ever seen. Even Wirecard was a bank confirmation fraud. If you look at that, it was only a $2 billion fraud. Parmalat, Italian dairy company, $4.9 billion fake bank account. Really simple. I told you guys I figured it out. Other people were going to figure it out too. So Bank of America had been sued for $10 billion for what they thought was participating in the fraud. They did not. They got out of that. They didn't participate in it. The company had actually just used their name. But Bank of America said, no more. We don't want to be sued for $10 billion. Again, we're going to mandate confirmation.com. And so they mandated the use of our service. And so in 2009, we hit cash flow positive. We were number 96 on the Inc. 500. We were just blowing and going at that point in time. I think In total, we had about, I don't know, 15 employees or something. It was less than 20. And I mean, it was literally the proverbial drinking through the fire hose, because we went from when Bank of America mandated, which was really a watershed moment for us, we had about 220 accounting firms using us. And that was in the first 8 years of doing business. 5 months later, we had 4,500 accounting firms using us. And so the amount of volume and transaction flow was just incredible. So that year we hit cash flow positive and then stayed that way until we sold.
So we gotta get to that part of the story, right? Just
Yeah.
keep them interested, right? So what did the exit look like out of this whole thing?
So, I'll kind of give you the journey. So the game plan was always to hit kind of cash flow positive and then to potentially put the business on the market. And so we hit cash flow positive in 2009. We we hired a banker, kind of looked around. And as you guys may know, right, 2008, 9, 10 were terrible years for valuations. We were in a fortunate position to be able to say no thank you. And so we said no thank you. A lot of my friends who had businesses, they were taking 50% haircuts like they are today on valuations, and multiples were terrible. And so we just continued to grow. We actually paid dividends in 2010 and 2011, which was nice because I finally got some money out of the business for the first time. But we were able to grow. So we were, as I said, we were number 96 in the Inc. 500. Then we were number 169 the next year, which only about a third of the businesses make it 2 years in a row. And then for 10 years in a row, we were in the Inc. 5000, which like less than 0.1% of businesses are able to accomplish because our growth rate was so high. But we looked that year in 2010 and said, no thanks. So we said, all right, what's the next marker? We said, when you hit 20 million in revenue, that kind of gives you an extra multiple. So we started to look around at that point in time, hired a banker, and we said, hey, we want to sell the business. And as he got to know us, a guy named Steve McLaughlin, he owns Financial Technology Partners, FTP. And by the way, if you look him up, he was the highest paid investment banker in the country last year. Steve's great. He said, why do you guys want to sell the business? And we said, well, we've been in it a long time, want to have some liquidity. I said, I've got 2 assets, and all my great friends at Owen keep calling me and telling me I need to diversify my asset portfolio. And I'm like, it's my house and this business, and that's it. There is no diversification. And so I wanted to be able to diversify. And so as we started to talk, he said, look, you guys love the business, it's growing, you guys are crushing it, you really enjoyed the team, we built a great business. We had offices in 15 countries at this point in time. And he said, have you thought of something else? And we said, like what? He's like, well, what about debt? And I said, look, we've been there, don't want to have any debt on the books. We never did. After we paid it back in 2010, that was $1.4 million that we paid back with interest. We never had debt again. And I said, I'd just like to be cash flow positive. It's a good place to be. He said, what about majority investor? And we said, well, if somebody's going to own us, but we don't want to have a significant component of our equity tied up in somebody else's decision making, right? They may do something different with the business, they may have a different timing, not necessarily interested. He said, how about a minority investment? And I said, well, in all honesty, I want a transaction that if the whole business went to hell in a handbasket, I could still retire. And he said, what if I could do that? And I said, if you could do that, we're in. And he pulled the rabbit out of a hat, and we got a $60 million minority investment. It was all secondary capital, so we took all that money out other than $5 million that the partners of Great Hill out of Boston, Great Hill Partners, they're awesome, wanted us to put $5 million on the balance sheet, but we were cash flow positive. We had a huge cash balance, so we never needed that money, never used it. But we gave $55 million back to all the shareholders, which was a great deal. And so at that point we said, all right, 6 years we're going to go and we're just going to grow this thing and then do it again, right? Look to sell. And about a year into it, a company called Walters Kluwer, which is out of Europe, big company, they go by CCH in the US, had called us and said, hey, can we come see you? We said, sure. So we were always talking to people, right? You get on the Inc. 500, people are always talking to you. And so they came in and got the update, and then they said, hey, come to New York. Sure, we come up there. We met with them, and they said, hey, we want to buy you. So we're not for sale. We just did this $60 million recap. We're going to grow. And they said, well, what would it take? And then we did a little dance where we didn't say anything. And they, as soon as you put a number on, that's the max, right? They're not going to go above your number, so don't say a number, right? So they were like, what would it take? And we said, well, what do you got? And you make the offer. You knocked on my door, right? And so we ended up hiring a banker, William Blair out of Chicago. And earlier we had run a PE only because we didn't want a strategic. It was just a funding. This time we did strategic only, so we didn't do any PE firms in this. We did a strategic only process, and Wolters Kluwer, largest competitor, Thomson Reuters, came out and was the top bidder. So they bought us in 2019 for $430 million. So we had recapped it. We sold 42% of the business for $60 million, so basically about $135 million valuation. 2 years later, we sold it for $430. So Great Hill was ecstatic. They got a significant return for their investors. All of our investors were happy. So it was a great day. It was really cool. So we were fortunate enough to have a great exit. There were some things that the press and media didn't know. I don't think we told them, but there were over 60 people who made more than $1 million in the business, which was really cool. We had, in every financing round, every employee and every board member had invested. That was kind of one of the things, and one of the things I always felt obligated. If we were going to go raise money and ask other people to bet on us, we circled the wagons first and said, hey, how much are we in for? Because we have to prove to people that we believe in what we're doing. And the best way to do that is to put your money where your mouth is. Not just tell them you got a great idea, but put your money there. And so every employee and every board member invested in every round. And then, as I said, about a third of the investment typically came from current investors as well. And that gave a lot of people a lot of confidence to want to continue to invest in us. And so we had programmers who made over $1 million simply because they had continued to invest in the business. So those kind of things were really cool. That was neat. It was actually, so Jermaine, he'd come on, he'd invest a little bit, and he had passed away about a year before we sold. And he'd come on as an advisor and given him some stock. And when we sold, I had to track down, I think I called Owen, I know I called Owen, and they gave me some information on his sister who was over in Germany, his daughter who was over in Germany. His son was here, and I ended up tracking his son down through his ex-wife, which is a funny story. I called her and I'm like, hey, I'm trying to find your husband, and you guys all get the spam calls. And she's like, who is this? And what are you? I'm like, I'm trying to give him money. Like, sure you are. But so I gave him like, hey, Jermaine was my professor and his advisor. So I gave her enough to make her feel confident. And then she was like, well, I'll take your number. Right? So later that day, Jermaine's son called me, and I remember this. I was driving home, and he called me and he said, hey, this is Bob Bear, and I said, hey, I'm Brian Fox, and Jermaine was my professor and a mentor and an advisor, and I don't know if you know this, but he had some stock in our business as an advisor. He's like, no, we're still going through Dad's stuff, trying to sort through everything Jermaine had. And I said, well, we just sold. And I said, in Jermaine's stock is, you and your sister will get a check for just over $600,000. And he was like, oh my God, And so making those phone calls was really, really cool. That was one of the more fun things. I'll share one. So my in-laws ended up investing. Again, no doubt they were like, who is this worthless son-in-law that we're investing in? They probably felt obligated, obviously, right, because I married their daughter. And my mother-in-law had passed away, and my father-in-law's a doctor, which you guys know they're terrible investors. They barely cross the street on their own, right, but they're really super smart. So I called him, and we get this report of people who hadn't collected their money yet, and from the escrow agent. And so I called him. I said, hey, Steve, we get this report, you haven't gotten your money yet. He's like, oh, I know, Brian, I'm so sorry, I need to call him. Congrats on the sale, by the way, and yeah, I need to get him my wire instructions. I said, yeah. I said, so you haven't gone in and logged in and seen what you're getting? He's like, no, I haven't. I said, well, now he had invested $25,000. And I said, well, Steve, playing along, I said, what would be a good return on that? And I know he was probably like, well, the fact that my worthless son-in-law is giving me my money back is a good thing. And he was probably thinking, I don't know, like, 2 times, 3 times, whatever the number would be, right? Maybe 100,000 would be really cool, right? Rounding up to 6 figures. And he's like, oh, Brian, I don't know. And I said, Steve, you guys invested you and Linda invested $25,000. I said, how would a check for $1,042,000 sound? He was like, oh my God. So I'm off the hook there.
Forever best son-in-law.
Yeah. So those kind of things were really cool. But it was great. We had a great team. We had 220 employees when we ended up selling, offices in 15 countries, operated in 184. So it was really cool. We were all blessed. And the neat thing that you almost never see, especially if you watch these, the Facebook stories and all these things, right? The 4 of us that were in my grandmother's garage were there 19 years later when we sold it. And you almost never see that. So that was probably one of the coolest things.
Neat. That's neat. Well, I'm going to turn it over to you for questions, but while you're thinking, I'll give you 2 seconds to think. Give us 1 or 2 pieces of advice for a student entrepreneur sitting here that's thinking that would be pretty cool. I'd like to figure out how to do that myself. What 2 or 3 pieces of advice would you give?
So a good friend of mine's in the music business, like so many people in Nashville. Sean McSpadden, he's over Red Light Management and manages a lot of artists. And when he goes to speak at Belmont, because they've got that great music program over there, he always tells them the same thing I'll tell you guys. He's like, you don't want to do this. It's really, really hard. He's like, the reason I'm sitting in this chair is because I was out with the artists until 3 or 4 in the morning, and I was in the office at 8 a.m., right? The artists get to sleep in, we don't. So if you want my job, if you want to sit in this chair, you're going to have to work those kind of hours and work your tail off. And most people don't want to work that hard. And so the thing I'll tell you guys is there will be a time when it is really, really hard and really, really tough. And you got to have the fortitude to say, never give up, right? What Jermaine's tagline was. You just have to figure it out. You have to be creative. You have to love problem solving. And you have to just kind of get out there and figure it out. You're going to operate with much less than perfect information and visibility. You're going to operate maybe 20% of the information you need to actually make a real decision. And you got to make them in real time and fast. And so a lot of the entrepreneurs I invest in today, I give that advice to. It's like, look, you're going to have to buckle down. You're going to have to work your tail off. You got to build a culture of ownership. And we did that to allow everybody to invest in the business. Because you want your employees and your staff to be partners with you. You want them waking up on Saturday morning trying to solve that problem. You don't want them going home at 5 o'clock and checking out, right? They need to be in that business with you, because an entrepreneurial business is extremely hard. It's extremely tough. And a lot of people see the niceties, right? But we were also cleaning out the toilets at the end of the day, right? When a laptop broke, you're the one on the phone with Dell trying to get it sorted out, right? You don't, like I did at Ernst & Young, take it down to the second floor, get a loaner for the day, and they call you back with your laptop's fixed, right? So all of those niceties that the big corporations have, you don't have as an entrepreneur, and you got to be okay with that, and your team's got to be okay with that. But the rewards can be fantastic, and the culture that you build is key. But that's probably one of the things, and I'd say always invest in yourself and get your team to invest, because investing in yourself is the best opportunity, right? You look at the public markets, right? My mom had some of my dad's life insurance policy in WorldCom, right? And everybody wakes up one day and WorldCom's gone to zero. So even public companies are not that safe of an investment. At least in an entrepreneurial business, you know what your revenues are. You know whether or not you're going to fail today or tomorrow. So you have great visibility in that. So invest in yourself. And if you're doing that, others will as well, from that confidence.
Great.
Yeah, what questions do you guys have? Yeah, I'm here for you guys. Ask anything, seriously.
All right, well, on that note, how many rounds of investment did you do total? And if you don't mind me asking, how much were you diluted down in equity?
Yeah. So you start off with 100 and you get diluted down, right? But as long as the pie is bigger, it's fine. So we did a family and friends round, which kind of over a 2-year time frame. Then we did the $750,000 with a bridge, then the A, and then the B. So really for funding to get to cash flow positive, we did 4 rounds of funding, which is about $11 million. And then we did the $60 million minority recap. And so even in that, even though we were taking money out of the business, we all put money back into the business as well. So we invested even at those terms again. And then when it ended up selling, I had essentially 20% of the business at that point in time. So that 100 came down to 20, but the pie got a lot bigger. And I would tell you to share your equity with your team. Be fair to your investors. I've seen a lot of businesses where essentially the entrepreneurs go out and tell people, hey, here's my business plan. They raise money, then they don't achieve the business plan, they go raise more money, and when they do that, they dilute their investors and then option themselves back up to exactly where they were. And in all reality, I don't think that's fair. It's legal. There's nothing illegal about it, but I don't think that's a fair value proposition, right? If you told people you could do this, and I've told some entrepreneurs this, I'm like, my check cleared, right? So if I invested $100,000 in your business for whatever, owner, call it 10%, my check cleared. So you got the full $100,000, but you didn't deliver the revenue you said. So My end, I held up my end of the bargain. You didn't hold up your end. You didn't achieve the revenue numbers you said you could, right? And you're the one closest to it, and it was your idea. So why are we the ones having to pay the penalty for that? Just be fair to your investors. They'll be fair to you, and they'll continue to kind of bless you with further support and investment. Otherwise, I think you get sideways with folks if you don't treat them correctly. Again, it's not illegal, but I think it's a more ethical way to do business. What other questions do you guys have? Yeah.
David Frederickson,
Yeah, man, how you doing?
96, Breezy grad. A couple of years ago, I asked you, I said, what happens if you're trying to scale, you bring on new clients, and your systems are creaking like crazy and about to fall apart? What do? And you said, slap duct tape on it, keep moving. Can you tell us a story about when you dealt with something like that?
Yeah, you want to try and figure out whatever you can do to make it happen, right? I was always, the whole duct tape was true, right? I would give away the MacGyver award. I don't know if you guys ever watched MacGyver, it kind of came around, but he'd fix everything with like chewing gum and duct tape. I gave this creativity award for whoever solved interesting problems creatively. And, for a technology business, a complete rewrite is huge. And you basically say, we're going to stop all development in terms of adding new function feature for our customers for, a year to come out with kind of that 2.0 version. So it's a significant undertaking to do that. So my advice is, figure it out, duct tape it together, do whatever you can for as long as you can until you can't do it anymore, until it's not scalable. And then you're going to have to do that rewrite, right, to make your technology stack scalable. So we ended up doing that. We did it once. So we had our 2.0 version. And actually when we got bought by Thomson, we were right in the middle, or beginning, we'd probably done 25%, but we were right in the middle of kind of 3.0 for us, because going international, we needed to be in Unicode so we could support all the multiple languages and currencies and all the things that we had kind of duct taped together up to that point in time. And we had a lot of function and feature. We had a lot of tech debt, right, legacy tech, that we were still supporting, and we needed to build on a new code base and kind of get rid of all that legacy debt, tech debt, because it was kind of weighing it down, right? It was the throughput, those kind of things. And we put out an update, and something would break because we hadn't remembered it, right? So we needed a new 3.0. Interesting, when Thomson bought us, they said, hey, stop that and rewrite it in their new version, what they called Hunview at the time. And big companies have big issues. They're slow. They're like big behemoths to turn. And they bought us in 2019. They still haven't come out with 3.0 yet. So we're literally still operating. The system will do 103 million in revenue this year, and it's still operating on 3-year. Almost nothing's changed in 3 years since they bought us, which is I don't think that's great for the customers. I'm not there anymore. It's not my choice, but it's hard to do that rewrite. But sometimes you just have to buckle down and bite the bullet. But I'd push it out as long as you can. Other questions? Yeah.
So it sounds like early in the journey, it was you were essentially just surviving and going paycheck to paycheck. Did you have some traction or some inkling that this had legs? Like, was there any kind of light at the end of the tunnel for you, or was it just surviving day by day?
I obviously believed in what we were trying to accomplish, and a lot of it was just survive day to day. I mean, one of the things I had, I'd buy a box of Q-tips, and I was like, all right, I want the business to be in business by the time I finish this box of Q-tips. Right? So sometimes I wouldn't clean out the ears in the morning just so I can, but that's true. Like you have to set your little individual goals of I want this business to still be in business a month from now, or that kind of thing. So you just figure it out, right? And you set you know where you're headed, but you got to set those little objectives and celebrate with the team. Right? As I look back, there were so many times looking back when we were really so close to failure and having no money. I mean, and you do interesting things, you do creative things. Like I remember AmSouth we were trying to get them to come on, and their guy had pushed back a lot, but we finally got him where he liked the service and the idea. And he said, well, we can't come on this year because our budget, we've already done our budget, we have to do an IT security review. And our budget's already used up, so we'll look at you guys next year. And I'm like, well, how much is that security IT review? How much do you guys get hit for? He's like, well, it's $10,000. And this is when we're in the garage. And I said, well, how about if we pay that $10,000, right? Rolling the dice, because if we didn't pass, I still owed him the 10 grand. And he's like, well, all right. And so then I said, well, can we pay you a year from now? And he said, okay, you know, it's funny, but okay. And my team was like, well, what happens if we can't pay him $10,000 a year from now? I'm like, well, we'll cross that bridge when we get there, right? We'll have bigger problems if we don't have $10,000 a year from now. He can sue us, come after us. But we got to get there first, right? And so they came on, and they weren't generating $10,000 in revenue at the time for us, but he did unfortunately remember and sent us a bill, and we paid him. But you know, you do things like that, so get creative. Yeah.
First, as a recovering CPA myself, as an auditor, appreciate your services.
Yeah.
Quite a bit.
Who were you with?
Dixon Hughes Goodman.
Yeah, great firm.
Yeah, Memphis.
Big firm. Yeah.
So, you know, starting off in the garage, my one question is, you know, how do you pick your team? You know, this is a high pressure.
Yeah.
You know, got to be dedicated. You got to, you know that you can rely on these people and they believe in you believe in them. And then second, you know, how did we get to determining what the price was going to be for, you know, providing restaurant from? I think you said $20. As we started off at.
So in terms of the hire rate, you're going with a gut check, right? I mean, it's your business is about the people. You know, you're going to rely on them. So it's just getting to know them, talking to them in a gut feel. And they always say, you know, hire slow and fire fast. Fortunately, we didn't have to let go of a lot of people. But in an entrepreneurial business, you don't have time to train people. You need people who can step in and do it. And, the type of people you need at the beginning is different than as you're scaling, right? So early on, you need a lot of Swiss Army knives, right? You need people who can do a lot of everything. And then as you continue to grow and scale, you need people who have more of a depth of knowledge in that area. And ideally, right, your team grows with you and can grow into those roles. And we did a good job of giving people that opportunity, but where we needed outside help, we would ultimately go and hire outside help to come in. But it was kind of going with a gut check and a feel. And one of the things I always look for that I figured out kind of the hard way was look for people who've been in early stage startup businesses before, because they know what they're getting into. If they only have big businesses on their background, they're going to come in and not having all the creature comforts, right? So to me, having people that had experience in early stage businesses was great, because they knew what they were getting into a bit more. In terms of the valuation of funding, it's really more art than science. I mean, there's a semi-science to it. But certainly when you're pre-revenue or early stage, it's more art, and it's more just negotiation and see what you can get, right? I mean, at one point in time, we had a guy, he offered us $1 million investment for 80% of the business. And, you know, we didn't have another alternative, but we turned it down. That just felt a little aggressive and a little predatory. So what I would typically tell people is just about in any funding round, kind of assume you're going to have about a third of the business. That's a good rule. You know, go out and ask for 15 or 20. You know, it's kind of that marketing, right? That 20 sounds a lot better than 19 to an investor. They'll probably ask for 40 or 45 or whatever, and then you guys negotiate from there. As you get bigger in a business, you can. There's a little bit more science. Like today, you can look at like multiples of revenue. Multiples have come down, right? When we sold, you know, we got basically a 9.5x revenue. Multiples today are somewhere between 4 and 7 is a high one right now. You know, they were in that 10 to 12, that 9 to 12 range. What's interesting about a SaaS-based technology business is you're fortunate that you get to be invested at based on a multiple of revenue. As soon as you hit kind of cash flow positive and hit that positive EBITDA number, you become an EBITDA multiple. You don't want that, because those get low. So what we did, we always managed our bottom line to $1 million of net income. Sometimes we'd overachieve that. We'd have $1.5 million. Sometimes, you know, we'd spend a little bit more. But when our investors came in to look at it, we always said we had a managed bottom line. So if we budgeted and we had $5 million going to the bottom line, we were like, okay, where can we invest $4 million more in the business to grow it? And that was kind of our growth capital. So that was how we figured out how to budget, was what do we need to operate? Then what's left over, subtract $1 million, and that's our growth capital for the year. And that's how we ended up growing. And when we sold to Thompson in 19, after 19 years, we're still growing at a 36% annual growth rate, which is hard as that base continues to get bigger and bigger, right? It makes it more difficult, but that's why you get the high multiples in a SaaS-based business. Good question. Yeah.
When it came to the leadership within the different functions of the business, so you had marketing, you had sales, operations, technology, and the strategy that the leadership for each of those functions would perhaps bring forth. If you found that the strategies weren't necessarily aligned, how would
Great
you work
question.
that out?
Great question. So I am a huge fan of Scrum. And not just Scrum for technology development, actually Scrum for the entire business, because it forces you to set prioritizations, right? So your question is absolutely spot on in terms of what I see in so many businesses that are at that growth stage, right? When you start the business, and it was the four of us in the garage, we were literally in a room smaller, about the size of this little area right here, right? So I sat here, Jeanette sat here, Dave sat here, Chris sat there, and we overheard everybody's conversation. We could turn our chairs and talk about the customer call or the technology, whatever, right? It was real-time information. The communication channel was right there and immediate, so everybody knew what we were focused on, what customer was the most important, what do we need to build into the application to get that customer, or whatever the deal was, right? We were right there. As your business grows and scales, that's a brilliant question, because what happens is the marketing people think, well, here's where I think the priority should be, and the technology people think, well, here's the function and feature I think is going to be best, and the salespeople are over here selling stuff, and the customer support team's saying that the salespeople are all liars because they're selling stuff we don't have yet. And so you have these multiple priorities. And Scrum really forces the management team to say, how are we going to value prioritization? And we based it on revenue. Maybe a number of customers, whatever it may be, but we would look at all the possibilities and we kind of stack rank them. And we start at number 1 and then 2, and wherever our resources ran out, that was where we stopped. So everybody knew what we were focused on, right? Because the team in Japan, they wanted to hire 2 more people, but yet the people in South America also wanted to hire 2 more people. And one of the things that it was a great model for us. I would absolutely go recommend reading Scrum, the book.
Quick definition for.
Yeah, so it essentially forces you to provide transparency and prioritization. And what happens is we were able to prioritize that and based on revenue. And so we would say, hey, the South America team, the revenue return for those 2 hires is this. In Japan, it's here. And so while they didn't like being told no, they understood why. And it was up to them to go build a better case of why they needed the 2 hires or why they needed that functionality, right? Salespeople are always coming in and saying, hey, if we build this functionality, somebody will pay for it. Well, I mean, you got a list of things. I mean, I still have some of my things that never got built. And they were my idea, right? But I had to be realistic about stack ranking them based on value to the business. And so you stack rank those based on value to the business, and revenue was that target for us. And you build that revenue. All things being equal, grow your revenue. Technology people love building and tinkering and adding function and feature, but you got to have the revenue, right? So don't lose the good for great over here, right? It's good enough. You only need 80%, 70% to get out there and get it done, right? So it's that MVP, that minimally viable product. Get that out there and get it done, and ruthlessly prioritize. And if you're doing that, then the whole organization knows what the priority is, and you don't have to go out there and ask and tell people. That was one of the problems I had at TR, at Thompson, was they had these kind of random, non-tangible things like, we want the customer to be happy. What does that mean? Like, my definition, your definition may be build function and feature. My definition may be send them a masseuse every day. That would make them happy, right? But I told Thompson, I'm like, look, you have to be very specific, right? On a football team, if the goal is to win the Super Bowl, and you're a lineman, and you go to the Green Hills Mall to go to a movie, and you can get the Milk Duds, buttered popcorn, and a Coke, or you can get the almonds and a water, we all know what the answer is if the goal is to win the Super Bowl. So the answer becomes obvious, right? If the objective and goal is clear and everybody understands it. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned that Thanksgiving was a shareholders meeting, and especially at the beginning stages when you don't have a lot of runway. Did you have any experience with any investors that might have been like detrimental or even toxic to the business?
Yes, we did. I had some early, and they didn't invest. We had some early employees who were kind of toxic that we had to get rid of. They were stealing from me, and that was difficult. I want to figure out that they were basically having an affair, these 2, and they were stealing at the same time, going on these trips that they said for the business that weren't. And so we didn't have to let them go. We did have some investors. I mean, all of our investors, I think, were pretty great. You have some that, ask a lot more questions at the shareholders meeting. So you know who those are going to be every year. But no, I mean, our shareholders in general were great. They were very supportive. And they kind of always helped introduce us to other potential investment sources. So, yeah. Yeah.
When you started out, were you competing with another service, or were you inventing the market?
We created it. There was no other service. So the postal service was our largest competitor, right? And the good news is they didn't know we were there and they weren't fighting back. And that was difficult, right? Being the absolute first to start something, because we had to go out and tell people what we were doing. And so I'd have these older partners at CPA firms be like, "Oh, you're going to email everything." I'm like, "No, we're not emailing anything. Like, it's online. Your staff will log in. It's all behind the firewall. It's safe and secure." So we literally had to teach people about the internet and about a secure clearinghouse and about the service. And I had to go get to the regulators and get them to update the standards both in the U.S. and internationally. So kind of did all that heavy lifting and legwork, which was tough, and it took a lot of time to do that, but it was an investment in making it happen. So it was hard to be the very first. We've had, over the years, probably 15 or 20 competitors, and we bought several along the way, just kind of open up new markets or kind of add a new service for us. But really in our business, what's interesting, and you think about it, right? I mean, if you guys want to buy something at an auction site, you're still going to eBay, right? Most people can't even name another one. At the time, eBay was pretty small. Yahoo came out with an auction site, and they failed miserably because eBay had the customers, right? And so today, the reason why we really have no competitors today is because if you're an accounting firm, right, Dixon Hughes, you're using confirmation.com. If you come up with a new service that's less expensive, you're like, Dixon Hughes says, "Hey, great, how many banks do you have?" You say, "Well, I don't have any," right? Well, tell us when you have 6,000 banks like confirmation.com, right? Same thing if you go to the banks. It's like you go to Bank of America, like, "Hey, we didn't charge them, so it was free service, but maybe you give them better bells and whistles." They're going to say, "Great, tell us when you got 16,000 accounting firms that are using you," right? Because they want that volume, right? So it makes it very difficult for somebody to get in to that kind of a market, that network model. That's why it's so valuable at the end of the day in terms of the multiples.
So once you had the network effects, did you start raising prices?
We didn't. We kind of, I think your question is more on the price of the service, but we really kept it the same. We raised it to $23 later. But really Great Hill was kind of the ones who looked at our model, and we were kind of like, look, we're growing at 40, 50%. Like, why complicate things by raising price? We can always do that. But they were right. I mean, that was the good thing about having an investor who came in and had investments. They wanted us to raise prices even more, and we agreed to do about half. So, we always had 100% board vote on everything we did, and they were great investors. But they encouraged us and pushed us in the right ways. The way we got to $20, my business plan, I think I started at like $9.95. And when I talked to accounting firms, they're like, "Oh, we pay more than that." So I kind of did a survey and just ended up at 20. So that was kind of how we got there. And then interesting, so when you're early, everybody wants that brother-in-law discount, right, to go for early. So we raised the retail price to $30 and then told them they were getting like the brother-in-law discount down to 20. So everybody was paying 20. And they all thought they were getting a deal. So, kind of the way you do it. Other questions?
We're gonna, it's coming up on time.
All right.
But Brian, this has been awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Sure, thank you guys.
Thank you all for the great questions. This was fascinating.